This lecture focuses on Prophet Muhammad and the beginnings of Islam. In this lecture, we will explore what Prophet Muhammad's life was like before receiving the first revelation or messages from God according to Muslim beliefs. We will then consider the message he received, what made it unique for the first recipients in the early 7th century, and some issues related to the sources for the study of the life of Prophet Muhammad and the issue of veneration of the Prophet. Let me mention a couple of points to keep in mind when we go through this lecture. First, I am presenting here how the Islamic tradition or the Muslim tradition by and large presents the life and message of Prophet Muhammad. In a sense, it is a Muslim perspective and would be generally speaking familiar to Muslim scholarship and Muslims. Second, there are historians of Islam, particularly from the West, who would question some aspects of this Muslim narrative about the Prophet and the early beginnings of Islam. There are also a few Western revisionist historians of Islam who might even go further and question even the very existence of Prophet Muhammad. But by and large, Western historians of Islam would be comfortable with the broad features of the Muslim narrative about the Prophet. For our purposes in this lecture, our focus is on the Muslim narrative. So, who was Prophet Muhammad? Prophet Muhammad was born in Mecca in Arabia in 570 or 571 of the Common Era. His father's name was Abdullah, and he was a member of the Quraysh tribe, the most dominant tribe there in Mecca. His father died before he was born, and he was raised by his mother Amina. But she also passed away when he was just 6 years old. He was then taken care of by his grandfather, who also died 2 years later. Left without any immediate family, the young Muhammad was taken in by his paternal uncle Abu Talib and was raised by him along with his own children. In other words, Muhammad was an orphan and had to struggle in his early childhood. This is something that must have left a significant mark on him. The concerns with orphans and those who were left out was a significant part of his interest in his prophetic career as well. We know relatively little about this period of his life, but we know a little more about his adult life. When the young Muhammad reached adulthood, he worked in the caravan trade, just like many other Meccans did. He was employed by a wealthy woman named Khadija, who was widowed. He was highly intelligent, honest, and smart at his work, and the business he was involved in prospered. Perhaps it was these qualities of the young Muhammad that led the owner of the business, Khadija, to propose marriage to him. Muslim tradition holds that Muhammad was 25 years old, but Khadija was 40 years old. This means she was 15 years older than Muhammad. Muhammad and Khadija had several children. They lived an unremarkable life until he was 40 years old. It was then, in 610 of the Common Era, that he started receiving, according to Muslim tradition, a series of messages from God or revelations. From then on, he becomes a prophet, and Muslims refer to him as Prophet Muhammad. And usually, when Muslims mention the name of Prophet Muhammad, they also would say a little prayer, which is peace be upon him, or in Arabic, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It is a way of showing respect to Prophet Muhammad. What was the first revelation or message like? According to Muslim tradition, despite the busy commercial life he was involved in, Prophet Muhammad was bothered by some aspects of life in his town of Mecca. Perhaps to give himself a break, he used to go out of Mecca and spend time or some quiet time away from home, alone in a cave just outside Mecca. It was during one of those retreats, Muslim tradition holds, that he had this remarkable experience. In a dark cave, while alone, he heard a voice commanding him to read or recite. He lived in a culture in which reading and writing weren't very common, and Muslim tradition holds that he could not read or write, just like many other people in Mecca. The voice was commanding him to read, but he responds by saying, I cannot read, or I'm not a reader or reciter. The Arabic phrase can be translated either way. The command was repeated twice, and he responded in the same way twice. For the third time, the voice went further. Let me provide the translation of the Arabic text. Recite in the name of your Lord who created human being of a blood clot. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught human beings what they knew not. These are Quranic verses, and you can find them in chapter 96 of the Quran. These are verses 1 to 5. Obviously, this is not at the very beginning of the Quran as we have it, but towards the end of the Quran. What was Prophet Muhammad's experience of the revelation like? And the question is, what was his reaction to this experience? Well, he was confused, worried, and he thought that something awful was happening to him. He didn't know what to make of it, and in fear, he rushed from the cave back to his home, back to his wife. He was shaken by the experience and reported this to his wife. She comforted him and said to him that God would not do anything bad to him, that he was a good person. One of Khadija's cousins in Mecca was a Christian who was able to read Christian scriptures. Khadija took Prophet Muhammad to this cousin, whose name was Waraqah. When the story was told, Waraqah said that this experience was similar to the experience of many biblical prophets he was familiar with through the scriptures. This provided some comfort to Prophet Muhammad. This is how the very beginning of Islam, according to Muslim tradition, was. These messages then continued for another 22 years until the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 of the Common Era. Muslim tradition also tried to understand the nature of revelation. Muslim theologians and philosophers had their theories. Some believe that revelation comes to people who are naturally ready for that, perhaps as a result of hard work and spiritual exercises that lead them to this kind of perfection or some kind of perfection of the spirit and ready to receive revelation from God. Others believed that revelation to any particular person is simply a decision by God. It is not something that can be induced as such through spiritual exercises and the like. We don't need to get into these theories of revelation. But once Prophet Muhammad was asked about the nature of the revelation, at least his experience of that, what was it like? He explained that in the following terms. Let me provide a hadith or a tradition of the Prophet which provides this information. This hadith is narrated by Aisha, one of the wives of the Prophet. She says, Al-Haris ibn Hisham asked the Prophet, "How is the divine revelation revealed to you?" The Prophet replied, "Sometimes it is revealed, or it comes to me, like the ringing of a bell. This form of inspiration is the hardest of all, and then this state passes off after I have grasped what is inspired. Sometimes the angel comes in the form of a man and talks to me, and I grasp whatever he says." Aisha then goes on to add, "Verily, I saw the Prophet being inspired divinely on a very cold day and noticed the sweat dropping from his forehead as the inspiration was over." What is important to note is that Prophet Muhammad made a clear distinction between his own thoughts and the messages he was receiving from God. And Muslim tradition also maintained the differences between these two. Let us now look at Prophet Muhammad's early prophetic career and some of the challenges he faced. We don't know very much about the early days of Prophet Muhammad's prophethood. The details are rather sketchy. Sources tell us that in the first 3 years, he was basically teaching the messages he was receiving from God to his immediate family and very close friends. The messages were a mixture of reminders to human beings of the wonderful things that God has done for them, that God was the creator and sustainer of everything, that God was one, and that human beings should take care of the needy and the disadvantaged and the like. They also reminded people of the end of times and what may happen then. The Prophet's preaching attracted quite a few people from amongst the disadvantaged people in Mecca. But most of the Meccan local elites were very hostile to his message. They saw his message as a threat to the local economy, which depended on pilgrims visiting the Kaaba, which is the most sacred site in Mecca. The elites saw his message as a threat to their own power as well. By challenging polytheism, which is belief in multiple gods, Prophet Muhammad posed a potential threat to the stream of people who visited Mecca each year to visit their deities or idols placed in or around Kaaba. The Prophet's rejection of polytheism meant rejection of the foundations of the economic and political system on which Mecca depended. Muslim tradition holds that after the first 3 years, Prophet Muhammad began to teach about his messages to the people of Mecca. It wasn't just about the idea that God is one that he was teaching. There was a lot about encouragement to the wealthy to share their wealth with those who were left out. It was also about asking people of Mecca to take care of the orphans and the needy and the poor. So the social justice message was side by side with the messages about God's oneness or God's unity. Initially, the Meccans were skeptical and they thought the Prophet was mad, or he was a poet producing beautiful texts of poetry. They compared the Quranic messages that he was reciting to poetry. In the pre Islamic Arab culture, there was a bit of connection between being mad and being creative. So it made sense to put the two together in the case of Prophet Muhammad. The Quran rejects these views of the Meccans about the Quran and the revelation in the strongest terms and says that uh, Muhammad is a messenger of God, sent by God with a powerful message to humankind. But the Meccan elite became more and more hostile and began to severely persecute those who followed the Prophet, particularly those people who were from the lower end of the society, such as the slaves. They mocked the Prophet. They tried to discourage people of Mecca from following the Prophet, and they tried everything they could to discourage the Prophet from continuing. 12 years after the first revelation, Prophet Muhammad had relatively few followers. They were mostly friends and family members and people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Let us look at the issue of the move of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina. As we learned in an earlier lecture, one's personal safety and security in pre Islamic tribal society was provided by one's clan or the tribe. This protection of the clan was available to Prophet Muhammad as well. But the death of his uncle Abu Talib, who was his most important protector, and also the death of his wife Khadija in the same year, that is, year 619, left Prophet Muhammad in a very vulnerable situation. He could have been easily assassinated because he did not have the necessary protection, or at least full protection, of the clan that Abu Talib, his uncle, was providing him. Things became so bad for him and his followers that they had to flee Mecca to another town in the north called Yathrib, or as it would later be known as Medina. Medina was quite different to Mecca. Unlike Mecca, which depended heavily on caravan trade, Medina relied more heavily on agriculture because of the availability of water there. It was an oasis. But it had other pressing problems. The continuous warfare and conflict between its tribes, as well as the competition for political and economic dominance between the various tribes there, particularly between the Jewish tribes and the non Jewish tribes, complicated the situation. The Jewish tribes have been living there for generations, and they were, by culture, Arab. There was a desperate need to bring the continuous warfare between its non Jewish tribes, in particular, to an end. The Prophet Muhammad's skills in arbitration was a useful one for the Medinan community. For various reasons, Medina became a more supportive place for Prophet Muhammad. Of the 5 tribes in Medina, there were 3 Jewish and 2 non-Jewish tribes. The non-Jewish tribes, by and large, became Muslim and provided the necessary support to the Prophet. The Prophet also hoped that by emphasizing the oneness of God or the unity of God and declaring the connection of his message to earlier biblical prophetic figures, the Jewish tribes in Medina would also follow him. But this did not happen. Let us look at the Prophet's migration to Medina and establishing a religious and political community there. First, let us think about the journey that took Prophet Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina. This journey is referred to as the Hijrah. It is an Arabic word meaning emigration or migration. This Hijrah or migration really marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. After Prophet Muhammad's death by a few years, the Muslim ruler or caliph at the time decided that Muslims should have a calendar of their own, and that calendar should begin with the Hijrah. So if you look at a Christian calendar, or if you look at the Christian calendar and the Islamic calendar, the year 622 of the Christian calendar equals year 1 of the Islamic calendar. The Christian calendar is based on the movement of the sun, and it is referred to as a solar calendar. And the Muslim calendar is based on the movement of the moon and is referred to as a lunar calendar. A lunar year is shorter than a solar year by 11 to 12 days. You may ask why this migration or hijrah was so important. Well, It is really the beginning of the growth of Islam and the Muslim community, from a persecuted small minority in Mecca to a well established Muslim community in Medina. It was from Medina Islam spread to the nearby regions and later to the rest of Arabia during the time of the Prophet. And it is from Medina Islam spread to outside Arabia as well. The strength, influence, and power of Islam spread from Medina. Without this migration, Islam would have had a very different history. Let us now look at the Charter of Medina. During the years in Medina, Prophet Muhammad was both a religious and a political leader. His message was received well in the city and the Muslim community grew. One of the first major things the Prophet did in Medina was to conclude an agreement between the Muslims of Medina and the Muslims of Mecca and the Jewish communities of Medina. In other words, it was an agreement that outlined how the Medinan society was to be managed. One of the key concerns of the Prophet was protection of Medina from internal conflict, that is, conflict between tribes, and from external threats to Medina, particularly those that would be coming from the Meccans, who were not very happy at all now the Prophet had fled from Mecca to Medina and established himself there. This agreement is usually known as the Charter of Medina or the Constitution of Medina. We will look at some examples of this in the class. This charter considered the different tribes of Medina, including the Jewish tribes, as part of one larger community. All people were free to maintain their religion. All were considered equal. All had to be part of the defense of Medina from any external aggression. There was no discrimination in this charter against the Jewish community, for example, because of the difference in faith. In Medina, Prophet Muhammad, relying on the revelation, set down many of the core beliefs and rituals of Islam that would come to distinguish the followers of Islam from other religious traditions. But religious freedom, or freedom of belief in religion, remained an important concern and was supported from the very beginning of the Prophet's teachings. Let us now look at the conflict with Mecca and the growing strength of the Muslims in Medina. Prophet Muhammad set about strengthening the new community in many ways, including militarily. This was mainly to counter any aggression, particularly by the Meccans, against Medina. Because Medina was hosting the Prophet and his followers, the Meccans could easily direct their anger at Medina. Sooner or later, some kind of military conflict was bound to occur between Mecca and Medina. If you look at a map of Arabia, you will notice that Medina is to the north of Mecca. Given that Meccans were heavily reliant on trade or caravan trade between Mecca and the northern parts of Arabia and southern parts, the Meccan caravan trade between Mecca and the north could be under threat because of the strategic location of Medina. The caravans had to pass between Medina and the Red Sea on their way to and from the north of Arabia. This is exactly what happened. Muslims wanted to counter the Meccan caravans because of the hostility the Meccans displayed against the Muslims. In 624, when the first battle or the encounter between Muslims and the Meccans occurred, it was the result of this strategy of Medina. In this, Muslims who were much weaker in terms of military strength and also in terms of numbers overwhelmed the Meccans. This encounter or the battle is called Battle of Badr, B-A-D-R. In this battle, there were 315 Muslims against 1,000 Meccans who were heavily armed. The Muslims had relatively few arms, but the Meccans were badly defeated. This success on the part of Muslims gradually led to the increase in their political influence and also military strength and recognition in the nearby regions and later in the rest of Arabia over a number of years. Various conflicts, some minor and some major, continued to occur between Medina and Mecca. And in 630, Prophet Muhammad marched on Mecca with a 10,000 strong army and took Mecca. There was no battle and there was no bloodshed as such. There was no revenge either. But the Prophet did cleanse the Kaaba by destroying all the idols placed in and around Kaaba and declaring that he was restoring Kaaba to the worship of one God. In a sense, he was returning Kaaba to the way Abraham and his son Ishmael did many centuries back. The taking over of Mecca was a turning point in the early history of Islam. Soon after, large numbers of tribes from different parts of Arabia came to Medina to visit the Prophet and to conclude a series of agreements which acknowledged the growing power of the Muslims based in Medina. These agreements granted freedom for those people to practice their religions and also a number of other rights in return for the recognition by those tribes of the Muslim state. During the last year of his life, the Prophet performed what is called the farewell pilgrimage to Mecca, and he delivered a very well known sermon or address to all Muslims. It emphasized the unity of the Muslim community based on the concept of brotherhood and sisterhood, and also based on the faith. There are a number of other important messages in this sermon, and we will look at some examples of this in the class. After this pilgrimage and after a brief illness, Prophet Muhammad died in 632. What was unique about Prophet Muhammad's message? Well, the Prophet's message challenged many aspects of the status quo of the 7th century Arabia. It directly challenged the polytheism of the pagan Arabs and called them to believe in and worship of the one God. While Christians and Jews had always been monotheistic, that is, they believed in the one God, the other Arabian people, that is, who are not Jews or Christians, placed their faith in many deities or gods. They built shrines to different gods, believing they were responsible for things like fertility and victory in battle. Prophet Muhammad established a unified community based around the brotherhood and sisterhood of all Muslims and shared faith in the one God, instead of a society divided by tribal and clan loyalty. The old ties of clan and tribe did not disappear as such, but the idea that the community should be based on the belief in one God became a powerful idea. In other words, the Prophet worked to create a community of believers that would go beyond tribal loyalties or clan loyalties. He also introduced a series of practices that Muslims consider to be part of the most fundamental practices of Islam. Let me mention some of them. First, the daily prayers that all Muslims are expected to perform 5 times a day, which help bind the community together. Second, zakat, which is a form of compulsory giving to the poor, the needy, and the community. This emphasis on giving and spending promotes a sense of common welfare and responsibility for others. Third, fasting during the month of Ramadan. Ramadan is a time when Muslims as a community show their dedication to Islamic values by sacrificing, eating, and drinking during the day. During this month, observant Muslims spend more time praying and reflecting on their spiritual state before God, as well as helping other people and doing good deeds. Fourth, the Hajj or the pilgrimage to Mecca. which reminds Muslims of their roots and their heritage. Prophet Muhammad also emphasized that people were accountable for their actions and that there was an afterlife where individuals would be rewarded or punished for their deeds. Instead of a tribe being punished for what one of its members had done, each person would bear individual responsibility for their actions. Let us look at a couple of examples of the uniqueness of the Prophet Muhammad's message. The Prophet introduced a range of rules and regulations and laws for his followers. The Quran calls for justice, compassion, and mercy for the poor and the vulnerable, and for all people in the society. The Prophet emphasized the principles of justice and fairness, and the importance of taking care of the vulnerable in the community, protecting them from exploitation by the wealthy and the powerful. He also established rules to deal with conflict. Before Islam, in many parts of Arabia, tribes typically created their own laws and rules, with responsibilities and rights determined by the tribal leaders and elders. The Prophet Muhammad introduced a series of rules that challenged some of these tribal laws. One example is in the case of killing of one person by another, which can be manslaughter or murder. Tribal norms of pre-Islamic times were changed to one that accepted the idea of life for life, but it is the convicted person that had to face the consequences, not any other member of the tribe. Even if the victim was a very powerful and wealthy person, only one life can be taken for murder, and that is the life of the convicted person. Tribal norms were different. This ruling provided a sense of security among families, as they knew that they did not have to fear mass vengeance for the misdeed of one person. Prophet Muhammad also changed many of the norms that applied to women, giving them agency, for example, to enter into marriage contracts and contracts in general, and they were given a specific share of inheritance. Prophet Muhammad strongly condemned the practice of infanticide, particularly prohibiting the practice of killing female children or infants. He also strongly condemned injustices against women within the family or in marriage and divorce. His reforms gave many new rights to women. A lot of these reforms would have been considered revolutionary at the time. Prophet Muhammad's teachings also emphasized a number of rights that we take for granted today, such as freedom of belief and religion. In general, one could say that Prophet Muhammad's teachings changed a wide range of values, norms, and practices of pre Islamic Arab culture and society. But this does not mean that the Prophet was going to change everything in that culture. By and large, he took on board the bulk of the values, norms, and and practices and rejected what he considered to be contradictory to his message. For example, the worship of multiple gods, female infanticide, or practices that disadvantage sections of the community. For example, injustices against slaves, the poor, and the needy. What this means is that there was a lot of continuity between pre Islamic culture and Islamic culture, but also there were marked differences. Prophet Muhammad did not claim to have established an entirely new religion. His message was a continuation of the earlier messages of the prophets who had come before him, such as Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Solomon, and Jesus. He therefore emphasized the continuity of God's message from the beginning of humanity to his time. Even though the basic message was the same, his teachings in many respects were also different as far as rituals, rules, and regulations were concerned. So, how do we know about the life of Prophet Muhammad? It is worth taking a few minutes to consider how we know so much about Prophet Muhammad and his life. Reconstructing the events of Prophet Muhammad's life is one of the most difficult and disputed topics in the study of Islam. This is mainly because we do not have a lot of reliable historical information about Prophet Muhammad's life that were recorded while he was alive. A lot of what has been written about Prophet Muhammad in terms of biographical works come from memories of the first 2 or 3 generations of Muslims documented around 100 years or so after the Prophet's death. But we do have sketchy information from various sources that we can use to reconstruct Prophet Muhammad's life. The most valuable source of information for this is the Quran, which records what the Prophet Muhammad recited as messages or revelations from God. The Quran spans about 2 decades or 22 years and covers a number of events that are connected to Prophet Muhammad, his message, and his community. In many places, it responds to the Prophet's historical situation. It describes the circumstances he experienced and his thoughts, feelings, and reactions to different events. However, the Quran is not put together or is not written in a chronological order. So, what we learn about the Prophet's life must be pieced together from the different parts of the Quran. It shows the humanity of Prophet Muhammad, his fears, his anxieties, his hopes, and his struggles in many parts of it. But it is not about Prophet Muhammad. The Quran is not about Prophet Muhammad or his life. It is not a biographical work about him. Other aspects of what we know about the Prophet come from other texts, including what is called the Sirah or the biographies of the Prophet. These texts provided the most detailed information about the Prophet's life. The most important biographical works were written by people like Ibn Ishaq, Al-Waqidi, and Ibn Hisham. These biographical texts were supplemented by hadith collections, Hadith. Hadith are traditions of the Prophet. These collections are books that narrate a wide range of reports about the Prophet, about what he said, what he did, and the like. These reports have chains of transmission that go back to the first generation of Muslims, who are referred to in the Islamic literature as companions of the Prophet. The most respected hadith collections for Sunni Muslims are those collections put together by Al-Bukhari, Bukhari, and the person whose name is Muslim. So, in general, 4 types of text have been used to find out the details of Prophet Muhammad's life: the Quran, the Sirah or the biographical works, the Hadith, and other general historical sources. Most of the detailed information we have about Prophet Muhammad's life comes from the time he lived in Medina until his death in 632. Finding out more about the Prophet's life is not just an interesting exploration. Many scholars believe that it is critical to interpreting the Quran as well. Today, there is a growing group of scholars who argue that the Quran must be interpreted contextually, that is, with an understanding of the original context of Prophet Muhammad in which the Quran was revealed. By understanding the original context, the reader can gain a sense of why a particular Quranic verse was revealed, for example. Let us look at the issue of how Muslims venerate the Prophet. Muslim tradition is very uncomfortable with the idea of producing images of Prophet Muhammad as well as of other prophets. We really don't have paintings or images of Prophet Muhammad. In Islamic tradition, there has always been a reluctance to create images of human beings. or living beings in general, particularly in the pre-modern times. Because of these concerns about producing images of the Prophet and the strong discouragement to create images of human beings or living beings, poetry and other forms of literature, art forms such as calligraphy or storytelling have been used in the Islamic tradition to describe the Prophet vibrantly, focusing on every little detail from the shape of his nose to the kinds of sandals he wore. Some Muslims are not only interested in the Prophet's message as such, they are interested in every aspect and detail of his life, hoping to emulate him in every way. They believe this is the best way to follow him and to worship God. This reverence and respect for the Prophet has been taken by some to an even greater level. Some Muslims see him not just as having a unique place in communicating God's revelation, but as someone who was more than human, or a little more than human, someone who was sinless and who had supernatural powers. However, these points of view do not seem to come from the Quran itself. When the Prophet's opponents challenged him to perform miracles, the Quran replied saying that the Prophet was only a human being like them. According to the Quran, the Prophet had no special knowledge of the unseen world, and he did not know when the day of judgment would come. Only God had that knowledge. In other parts of the Quran, Prophet Muhammad's humanity is very evident. There are verses that try to comfort him when he was disappointed or discouraged. In Mecca, he clearly experienced times of uncertainty and impatience when his message was rejected or when he was mocked. The Quran urged him to be patient at those times. In some of the Medinan revelations, Prophet Muhammad is encouraged to seek forgiveness for his own sins. There are many Quranic verses that made it very clear that the Prophet was a human being, but a messenger of God. For most Muslims, Prophet Muhammad is the best example of a perfect human being, a model of compassion and mercy, and a unique human being. However, the special reverence Muslims have for the Prophet means they are sensitive to others disparaging the Prophet. Words, images, or other ways of making fun of or criticizing or mocking the Prophet are taken by Muslims very seriously. This includes, for example, drawing cartoons depicting the character of Prophet Muhammad. Muslims take great offense at this. In summary, then, this lecture has looked at the life and message of Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet is central to the Quranic message. He was the person to receive God's revelation and to communicate it to its original recipients. Many scholars today believe that the Prophet was not only the recipient of the revelation, but some of the key aspects of his life and context are also reflected to some extent in the revelation itself. We also looked at some of his reforms that he introduced, the connection of his message to earlier messages of earlier prophets, the uniqueness of some of his teachings, the sources which can shed light on his life, as well as the veneration of the Prophet by Muslims. Thanks for watching. We hope this deepened your understanding of Islam. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series. Keep exploring. Don't forget to subscribe.